What are 10 characteristics of great audiophile playback system? That's what we're going to be talking about in today's video. Hey folks, I'm Gene Delasella with Audioholics. I want to talk to you guys about what constitutes great audiophile sound. On my drive home from the gym tonight, I was thinking of the top 10 things of how I define when you know you have great sound, an incredible playback system. You're hearing just a magical experience. And I was trying to compare what I was listening to in my car, in my BMW with a Harman Kardon system versus what I hear in my home. Obviously, there's a huge difference because you're not in an ideal situation in a car, and you can only do so much in a car audio compared to what you could do in home audio. So I came up with this list and what I think about when I'm sitting down in my theater room and I'm listening to music and how I define when I have incredible sound. And the first thing on this list is the speaker should disappear in the room. So if we're talking about whether we're talking about a 2-channel system or a multi-channel system, you really shouldn't be able to pinpoint the speakers. You shouldn't be able to look at the speakers and say, oh yeah, I could tell the sound is coming from those 2 speakers. Let's focus on 2-channel in this video mostly because I think it's really important in any system, whether it's 2-channel, 5-channel, 7-channel, or a high spatial audio channel count. It's really important to get your front soundstage right. I talk about that all the time. So the first thing I say is the speaker should disappear in the room. And in my situation, I have a pair of speakers in my theater room. I want to show you a picture. These are not small speakers. They're 7.5 feet tall. And you can see they're just enormous speakers. But when I listen to these speakers, I don't know that I'm listening to those speakers. When I sit down and I'm in my room at night and I have the lights down low and I've got good ambience in the room, the speakers to me just disappear. All I hear is the sound. I just hear almost like a live performance because there's so much dynamics, there's such effortless sound to it, and the boxes themselves disappear. I've heard lots of systems where it just sounds very boxy and very closed in, and that's the first characteristics when you know you have a system where the speakers just dissolve in the room and you don't hear the boxes anymore. That's one of the 10 characteristics I define as having great audiophile sound. The next one would be depth and width in soundstage. So you don't want to just have a wall of sound. I see on some of the Facebook groups where people just stack a bunch of speakers in their room and they run 2 or 3 pairs of speakers at the same time because they got this great wall of sound. That's not really audiophile sound. That's not really realistic in terms of developing a soundstage in depthness and in width. And I think it's really important if you want to hear all the details of what the artist was intending you to hear, as if you're listening to a jazz performance in a jazz club, you want to be able to hear the ambience in the room. And your speakers are going to produce that from the recording, but you have to have good acoustics and you have to have a good speaker layout. And how do you get depth and width? Is you have to have symmetry. And I talked about this in many videos, and I want to show you again an example in my theater room. You can see my left wall and my right wall has symmetry. I've got acoustic treatments on both walls. They're very symmetrical. The speakers are equidistant from each wall. And what that allows me to do is create a very realistic soundstage. The other thing is the speakers themselves are not up against the wall. They're actually out into the room. And I believe that plays a big role in developing depth of soundstage. And that's one of the disadvantages of in-wall speakers versus box speakers. And I know Matthew Pose would disagree with me on that, but I've never heard, if you take similar speakers, whether they're box versus an in-wall flush mount, identical drivers, it's just one is in the wall and one is a box speaker in the room. In my opinion, the box speaker in the room, all other things being equal, always has better soundstage to me. I hear more depth in the soundstage, and I think a lot of that is because of the acoustic delay from the sound reflecting off the front wall and back to you. I think there's some benefit to that. Even though you want to have good acoustic control in the room, you get to hear the spatial cues of the recordings better, the depth of it. And that's, to me, is a really important characteristic of developing a good soundstage for realistic, I would want to say live rendering of music, because you really want your playback to have lifelike dynamics and lifelike soundstage and presence. And that's another great characteristics of audiophile sound. Now, you can have all this, but if you don't have a strong phantom center, in other words, if you're in a 2-channel system and you're sitting between those speakers and you don't hear the vocals coming dead center, that's a problem. And that's something that I always have a problem with in car systems. And there's 2 schools of thoughts in car systems. I've heard many OEM systems. Some of them do a good job in developing that phantom center. Some of them either use DSP or they use a center channel to do that. And they have to do that in a very sparingly way because you don't want to have too much overpowering in the center. You want to have just the right amount of vocal presence in the center. And it's not just about the vocals either. If you're just listening to instrumental music, you want to have some type of anchor between the 2 speakers. And that's what I listen for when I'm listening to a 2-channel is, do I have good stable imaging? Do I have a strong phantom center? Do I hear the vocals coming from between the speakers as if there's a center channel playing? And if you sit down in my theater room and I give people demos, they actually don't believe me that the center channel is off. They have to go up and put their ear to the screen to make sure my center channel is off and I'm not playing any shenanigans. So having a really strong phantom center is very important. And how do you get that strong phantom center? It's all about getting the imaging right of your speakers, getting good speaker placement, having good room acoustics, and having your speakers matched. So your left and right speakers should have very similar performance characteristics. And when you get into the higher end speakers, the parts tolerances allow this. So the frequency response and everything else of that characteristic of that speaker is very similar from the left and right speaker. You get great pair matching. That's really important, and especially if you want to develop this strong phantom center. So number 4 would be effortless sound at all volume levels. Now, there are some systems that I've heard that sound good at low volume levels, but then they compress at high volume levels. And then I've heard some systems where they don't sound that great at low volume levels, but then as you crank it up, they just sound better. And some of that has to do with the tuning of your system. You have to make sure you have good tuning, good EQ in your system, but you also have to have a system that is capable of delivering lifelike dynamics without compression. And a lot of smaller speakers, especially if they're low sensitivity, they just don't have the amount of dynamic range if you put a speaker like that in a larger room. So you got to be careful that you're sizing the speaker to the room, that you have a speaker that can play at lifelike dynamics in the appropriate size room that you're going to have your listening space. And it makes a huge difference, not just for bass and not just for like theatrical effects, but just listening to brass instruments. I always hear a horn compression. If there's a problem with the horn and it just sounds really, it just gets very shrill sounding when you start playing it at louder volume levels, and it just doesn't sound natural on brass instruments or female vocals. So that's something that's really important, is that you have a system that has great dynamic range at low volume level as well as high volume level. And part of how you're going to get good dynamic range in the system is to also control the noise floor in your room. You don't want to have a loud room. You don't want to have a lot of outside traffic coming from outside your house. You don't want to hear people in the room next to you. You want to have good noise control in your room. And that's something that you can't always get in a car system, especially road noise. You got to really crank it up, and you just lose a lot of detail if you don't have a really low noise floor in your system. So the next thing, I am a bass head. I'm a bassaholic. You guys know that. Bass plays a vital role in your listening pleasure. You have to have good bass levels, but it can't just be boomy one-note bass. It's got to be tight. It's got to be articulate. It's got to be deep, and it's got to be punchy. And I can't emphasize that there are people out there that think you could just have a pair of speakers in a room. You can't have subwoofers because the subwoofers are going to pollute the sound. That couldn't be further from the truth. The best way to get better bass in your 2-channel system is to add powered subwoofers. Even if you do have pretty bass capable speakers, adding more sources of bass in the room is going to even out the bass distribution in the room. That way, every seat has better seat-to-seat consistency. So where you sit from, whether you're sitting from the center seat or the left or the right seat, the bass levels and the bass linearity should be very similar from seat to seat. And then you could EQ your system so you could flatten out the bass peaks in the system. Then you could raise the bass level up a little bit. And personally, the way I tune systems, I like my bass level below 100 hertz, about a 5 dB tilt up. As long as the bass is flat and linear, I like about a 5 or 6 dB boost in bass. That also depends on the floor material, whether you have a floor that's tactile or a floor that's hard, like a concrete floor. In those cases, when you don't have a lot of tactile energy in the room, you tend to need to turn the bass levels up to compensate. But bass is a huge vital importance to the enjoyment of your listening. So please make sure you don't skimp on your subwoofers, and you spend a lot of time doing a proper calibration of multi-sub and getting them to integrate well with your speakers. So number 6, I'm going to say you're in disbelief at how good the system sounds each time you listen. And not trying to brag or toot my own horn, but anytime I sit down in my theater room, and I usually only go there on the weekends and I listen to music or I watch movies, I actually am in utter disbelief at how good it sounds. Like, I go and put on some of my favorite music. I'm like, man, I don't remember it sounding this good. That's when you know you've got a really good setup and it's just created magic. Or even like over here, the speakers behind me with RBH, when I put on a record, I put on a really good vinyl disc, and I sit down and I just focus on the music. I'm like, man, these speakers just disappear in the room. It's just magic. If you're away from your system for a few days and you listen to mediocre sound, whether you're at a gym or you're in your car, and then you go listen to a high resolution playback system, it is shockingly good. And it's like a new experience all over again. That's a great characteristic that you have audiophile sound. So number 7 is your listening sessions last longer than planned. So most of my critical listening, again, is done on the weekends. I do like Friday night, Saturday night listening sessions. I post, music that I find in our community tab. So if you ever want to know what I'm listening to, check out our YouTube community tab. Friday and Saturdays, I tend to put music there. So my intent when I go and do a listening session is I'm like, I want to put about 2 hours in and I want to listen to music. Well, the next thing I know, after I'm listening, I look down on my clock and 3 or 4 hours pass. I'm like, damn, I put more time into sitting here listening to music than I anticipated. Usually I listen to music longer than I watch a movie. So that's another characteristic, is when you just can't pull yourself away from your system because it sounds so good and you're being immersed in the experience of it. That's a great characteristic right there. So number 8 is you hear details in recordings that you don't hear in lesser systems. And that, again, has to do with lowering the noise floor of your system, having a system that has effortless dynamic range, having a system that's very revealing and non-colored. And you hear these little subtleties. If you listen to Blue Dress from Depeche Mode Violator, you hear that little it goes all around the room just with 2 speakers. I never hear that in my car. I never hear that in most people's systems. But when I sit down in my theater room and I put that on and I stream it on lossless, it blows me away, the details in that recording. Or even in Michael Jackson Thriller, there's stuff in that recording, really good recordings, that you pick up on in a really revealing system that you don't hear when you're just doing casual listening in a system that isn't up to that level. So that's another great characteristic of audiophile sound. Number 9 is you can hear a huge difference in source material. So one thing I always notice when I'm listening to music in a car or I'm listening at a gym, you could put on a high-res source, or you could put on like 80s rock or 80s pop, and it all sounds the same. It all sounds, okay. You don't hear the major difference in dynamics. You don't hear the major difference in detail. But when you have a very high resolution playback system, bad material sounds bad. Good material sounds great. There's a big difference in how your system will sound based on the source material. And this is especially true when you go from lossless to lossy. There are many cases, and I love spatial audio, but when I'm streaming spatial audio on my Apple Music or Apple TV, and I'm streaming it on Tidal, some of the recordings have so much compression that I actually prefer 2-channel upmix. Yeah, you heard it. Sometimes I prefer taking a 2-channel lossless high-res signal or high-res source and upmixing with the Dolby Surround upmixer with the center spread feature turned on, as opposed to hearing some of the spatial audio renderings of the same album. Some of those renderings aren't that great, or they're just too lossy, they're too compressed, and you lose something when you have that much compression. So it's really important to have a good source material that's not lossy, that's not compressed. And number 10 is you long for your next listening session. So I live for the weekends. I'm here, I'm working, I'm producing content for you guys all week long. I'm writing editorials, I'm doing peer reviews of other writers' content. And I enjoy this. I love doing audio for a living. I love running Audioholics, but I live for the weekends. I live to sit in my theater room and enjoy the fruits of my labor. And you should as well. You should, in my opinion, you should treat your critical listening as sacred time for you. That's when you know when you have a great system, you're going to want to do that. You're going to look forward to doing that and to enjoying that experience and perhaps sharing it with others. It's always great when you could share it with your significant other or you have some good friends over, people that appreciate good sound. So guys, I hope you found this video useful. If you like this video, please hit the thumb up, hit subscribe. Don't forget about our Patreon channel at patreon.com/audioholics. We appreciate your support. You get direct access to me if you want to suggest video topics. Give me some comments down below. What's your favorite characteristic of great sound out of the 10 that I listed here? Give me some feedback below on what your experiences are with that. And until next time, my friends, keep listening.